Good afternoon or good evening if you're watching from Europe. Welcome to this edition of the Scott Ritter Show. The purpose of this program was to bring voices to a Western audience, in particular American audience, that might not otherwise be heard. And there was a focus on Russian voices and voices that could speak to the situation ongoing in Ukraine, etc. And I believe we've been extraordinarily successful in doing that. But, you know, the world doesn't just focus around Russia, and Russian issues aren't exclusively the concern of Russian individuals. We live in a very broad and varied world, complex geopolitical situations, and I think the events of the past several days, and if you've been following the issues for even months, regarding Russia and Iran shows that this is indeed the case. And I could think of no better person to invite to the show and discuss the Iran-Russian relations than my guest today, Professor Mohammad Mirandi. Thank you very much for showing up. Just so everybody knows, I think it's truth in advertising. We've spoken before. And I can say that I like this guy. So, you know, there's a little bit of bias here on my part. I just think we need to be upfront about it. I think he's one of the more informed, intelligent, and articulate commentators on the issue. Just let me give a little bit of bio before I turn it over to you, just so people understand the quality and character of the man that sits before you today. He was born in the United States. I think you'll detect a little bit of an American accent in the way he speaks English. I think he spent the first 13 years of his life here, and he returned to Iran. And at the time of the revolution, he volunteered to fight in support of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And he served in the military on the front lines. This is no armchair quarterback here, and he was wounded twice by chemical attacks. So this is a man who understands weapons of mass destruction and the harm that can be done. He's also a heck of a lot smarter than me. He got a PhD in both in Tehran and also in the UK. His thesis, I believe, dealt with Lord Byron and aspects of Orientalism. And some people have said that it is a response to Edward Said's book, I can't even say the word right, but Orientalism. And Edward Said is this phenomenal, legendary character. So anytime somebody says that somebody is the response to, you have to stand up and take note. And he's also been called who is that man that's hanging around the Iranian nuclear negotiating team? He's there in the shadows. He's on TV. And as I like to say, he's the smartest man sitting in front of you today. Ladies and gentlemen, Mohammad Mirandi. Sir, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you very much, Scott. I'm a big fan of yours. You've done a great job, and I disagree with you about the person who's more intelligent on the screen, but I'm very grateful for you to give me this opportunity to speak. And I follow you and I follow your work, and I've learned a great deal. In fact, we were supposed to be on a program together. Or at least I was told by Al Jazeera years ago that you would be joining me on the Doha debate. And I accepted the invitation. I went to Doha and I took part in the debate, but you weren't there. So I don't know if Al Jazeera never really told you, or for some reason you couldn't participate, but it was a big disappointment to not see you there.
No, I remember that very, very well, and someday we can talk about the reasons why I didn't show up. Trust me, I wanted to be there, and I would have really enjoyed the discussion. I don't know if it would have been a debate, because I don't think we actually disagree on too much, but we'll find something.
Same team.
Pardon?
We were supposed to be on the same side.
Oh, on the same team. That makes sense. All right, let's get down to brass tacks here. What's going on in Iran? I mean, if I turn on the TV, I see this. I see turmoil in the streets. I see anti-regime demonstrations. I see unrest in Kurdistan. I see, indications of monarchist groups rising up, the Mujahideen al-Khalq rising up, drone attacks now that appear to be linked to who? Israel, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, none, all three. Floor is yours, sir. Educate us. What's going on in Iran right now?
Thank you again. Iran is normal. It's quiet. I would advise your viewers to try to visit the country if possible, and they'll see that it's a very friendly country. If you sit in any taxi, you'll see that people are very open about their views, or if you go to the metro or the underground, you'll see people are very open about their views. It's been like that ever since I remember. And it's always, for me, very interesting when I hear the narrative coming out of the West, even from journalists who should know better, journalists who've been to Iran but who are part of the legacy media. It contradicts the reality on the ground. The narrative about the so-called regime being hated and unpopular is not new. It's been around since I remember, and the regime is about to implode. That narrative is also quite old. And it's also quite paradoxical, because on the one hand, we often hear that the government or the state, or like as they like to say in the West, the regime is corrupt, it is hated, it is imploding. We hear that on the one hand, yet simultaneously we also hear that it's on the rise, it's a rising threat, it's a danger to the world, which really, this paradoxical is unresolvable. How can you be imploding and collapsing and hated across the board, yet at the same time you're a rising threat for global security? You can't have both at the same time. But that is actually a part of that narrative of Orientalism, where you have these inconsistent ideas, but many people don't see the inconsistencies because they all fall within a broader narrative of negativity, of Iran being bad. So all of these somehow can be true at the same time if the observer, if the person who's looking into the narrative isn't careful about viewing those inconsistencies. But Iran did go through a tough time over the past few months after Ms. Mahsa Amini died. Immediately after her death, the Persian media in the West, BBC Persian, VOA Persian, and a host of other Persian media outlets immediately claimed that she was beaten to death and died under torture. So many people thought that this was true because they said it so convincingly and so so directly. And I thought it was probably true initially, being a bit naive myself, I suppose. And so people did come to the streets in different cities, not in huge numbers, but in significant numbers. But then gradually the narrative began to erode because footage came out where she had left a police van, she wasn't handcuffed, there was no sign of physical abuse. And then later on in the autopsy, where many very famous Iranian physicians took part, they said that there was no sign of, again, physical abuse. And it came out that she had a major operation on her brain when she was 8 years old. And then her father also, there's footage of him admitting, I say admitting because initially he denied this, but he admitted on the video that there was no sign of physical trauma on her body. So it was a tragic affair, and it revives the old debates about the enforcement of hijab in Iran, wearing a headscarf in the public sphere. But the facts about the particular case, this case, are quite different from the narrative. So after 2-3 days, when this the footage began to come out, and it became clear that there were serious questions about the claims made by the Persian media in the West, the protests died down, and then we had riots. And those riots were very violent. Persian media, again, in Western countries, were effectively, and I tweeted these clips of people of this, where people on Persian media in London would say that you should kill police officers, you should burn them alive. And these TV stations are working in London. If they were directed to an English-speaking audience or French-speaking audience, there's no doubt that they would be shut down immediately and taken to court. So over 60 police officers were killed, or people who were policing the streets. And so it was extremely violent. Now, that, as I said, that has died down. Now things have been quiet for many weeks. But with regards to the drone strikes, what we have heard is that it appears that the drones were flown from inside Iran. They were not long-range drones, so that rules out any Azerbaijan or even Iraq, even though Iraq is probably closer. But anyway, it rules out both. But it seems that, as in the past, the Israeli regime, they have recruited people in the Kurdish areas in northern Iraq, and they sent them inside Iran to carry out this operation, because that has been done many times before, and that seems to be what happened now. The 3 drones failed to hit their target. One of them exploded. Apparently it was struck by a projectile, and the other 2, I think, were caught in a net of electronic warfare net. Since the military terms for these things, and I don't. I know them in Persian, but not in English. You could better describe what I'm saying. So the attack failed, but what is interesting is that an advisor to Zelensky implied that Ukraine had something to do with it. And so that has raised serious questions in Iran.
No, I mean, it does. Before we go on, I just want to second one thing you said. You encourage people to visit Iran. And I've had the privilege of having the opportunity to do that. It was back in 2007, during the time of Ahmadinejad, when Iran was being reviled here in the West, in the United States. And when I landed in Tehran, I didn't know what to expect. I was expecting a police state. I was expecting rough treatment. And literally, once I cleared customs, I was on my own. Now, I'm sure people were following me. I mean, that's just the way it is. But I caught a taxi, went to my hotel, and there were no issues. When I walked through the streets, I was actually stalked by a guy, and I was getting nervous. And he a distinguished-looking man, and he was just following me and staring at me. And finally, he came up to me, and I said, "What do you want?" He said, "Are you Scott Ritter?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Why are you here?" And I said, "I'm visiting." He said, "Are you going to speak to our parliament?" And I said, "No." He said, "Good, because when you spoke to the Iraqi parliament, America invaded immediately, and I don't want you to speak to our parliament." So, it's just an interesting little story. But how engaged people are. They're aware of everything, and even somebody as obscure as me got picked out in the street. But now we're going to move on to the next question. The history of Iran and Russia. Today we see a picture that shows cooperation on just about every level. Very close diplomatic relations, economic ties, especially in energy, and now we're seeing, for sort of the first time, significant military ties. Iran has, from my understanding, always been reticent about engaging in this kind of military-on-military relationship with anybody, but especially the Russians. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was always tension between the Russian Empire and the Persian Empire back in the years leading up to World War I. In the Second World War, the Soviet Union invaded and occupied a significant part of Iran. They attempted to carve away part of it in Azerbaijan and create a Soviet republic. And I can tell you, as a Marine, one of the scenarios we trained for was a Soviet invasion of Iran to capture Chabahar and Bandar Abbas. And, we were prepared to go into Iran to defend Iran from a Soviet incursion, without Iran's permission, by the way. But my point is, under no circumstances would my personal experience with Iran during the Cold War lead me to believe that Iran would have a close relationship with Russia. And yet, here we are. Cooperation in Syria, cooperation in, maybe you can answer this question. The Geranium-2 drone, it looks an awful lot like the Shahed 136. Is it?
Well, let me go back to the past, and you're absolutely correct. There has historically been a lot of grievances in Iran directed towards Russia and the Soviet Union. But I think some things have changed, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, in the sense that Russia grew much weaker than it was during the Soviet times. We no longer have borders except for borders through the Caspian Sea. But now that Central Asian countries and the countries in the Caucasus have gained independence, we don't have any land borders. And so Russia today is not much of a threat to Iran. In my opinion, it's not a threat to Iran, but just to be on the safe side for those skeptics and those Iranians who are Western oriented, I would say that they're not much of a threat, so just so that I don't get them too angry. But in addition to that, our military cooperation with the Russians actually began after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And after a period of time, it grew more significant. But Russia and Iran were never all that close. I would say that the moment, and there are different events, of course, that we could look at, but I think the moment in which Iran and Russia grew somewhat closer to each other was over Syria. Because the Iranians in 2013, after it became clear that the tens of thousands of foreign fighters that were brought to Syria by NATO countries and oil-rich Arab countries in the Persian Gulf region, after they were beginning to overwhelm the Syrian government, ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the other Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar al-Sham and all these other groups, the Iranians decided to get involved to prevent the capital Damascus from falling. The same is true with Hezbollah and others. So the Iranian and Hezbollah's involvement began in 2013. So for a couple of years, for a while, they fought alongside the Syrian Arab Army against the extremist groups. And then General Soleimani went to Moscow to convince President Putin to get involved in Syria. And he succeeded in doing so. And that helped a lot because of the political cover that the Russians can give through their presence in the Security Council, and also because of the very effective air force that the Russians have. So basically the Russians were helping in the air, and the Iranians were supporting the Syrian Arab Army alongside Hezbollah and their allies on the ground. And that created a better relationship, or a closer relationship, or a better understanding between Russians and Iranians who were constantly cooperating, and especially the military. But I would also say that another phase of, let's say, or second phase in this, I would say, convergence between the two sides was the war in Ukraine. Because the Iranians, or many Iranians, not all Iranians, because many Iranians only get their news from the West, and they get their news from the Persian media based in the West, BBC Persian, VOA Persian, Deutsche Welle Persian, France Radio International, and all these other outlets, Iran International, which is a Saudi outlet in London, and the rest. So, but for many Iranians, there was a lot of sympathy, those with knowledge about what was going on in Ukraine, because of the behavior, the similar pattern that we saw in Europe. It was very similar to what we ourselves experienced over the last 40-some years. NATO lying to Russia, advancing eastwards, carrying out a coup, supporting right-wing and fascist groups like the Azov Battalion, among others. That reminds Iranians of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and what they did in Syria and Libya and elsewhere, and of course the Contras in Nicaragua. But that's not so much in the Iranian. Most Iranians would not know much about that, but probably a lot of people in Central America would understand the relationship. But in any case, people understood that there were similar patterns here. And then, of course, the killing of Russian Ukrainians and the war in the Donbass. It for Iranians, I think it revealed a lot, because it sort of repeated what we had experienced in Afghanistan, how the Persian speakers and the Shias, the Tajiks, the Hazaras, the Uzbeks were massacred by the Taliban 20-some years ago when they first took the country the first time around. Now the Taliban is a bit different from back then, but in any case, back then we had that experience. So many people understood the Russian position, and also NATO is a threat to Iran. If Ukraine succeeded in becoming a part of NATO, simultaneously we would have seen a new NATO member probably in the Caucasus, and then we would have more members. We have Armenia and Georgia, especially, and Azerbaijan. So for Iran, that would have been a major threat to their regional stability, to see NATO expand again to its borders. So that increased the relationship between Iran and Russia further. Iran has been exporting its technology to Russia. The Iranians don't deny it, although initially the Iranian Foreign Ministry, I think, made an unwise statement, which was incorrect, that we didn't send any drones to Russia. But then they corrected that and said we sent a limited number, but of course the word limited can mean different things to different people. But the point is that the Iranians, when they sell their drones to Russia, they don't tell the Russians what to do with the weapons that they purchase, or any other weapons that the Russians purchase from Iran, just as the Russians do not tell us what to do with weapons that we purchase from them. So the relationship between the two is increasingly strengthening, but it's not just the military. The Russians now need Iran much more than before, because relations with Europe have been destroyed, and they need a corridor, a trade route to Africa, to the Indian subcontinent, and to East Asia. And that corridor would go through Iran, whether it's through the Caspian Sea and to Iranian ports, or through the west or the east of the Caspian Sea. In other words, railway links, highways that go through Azerbaijan, potentially Armenia and Georgia, and also through Turkmenistan and Central Asia. So this north-south corridor is being developed as we speak, and also Iranian trade has been booming, Iranian-Russian trade, because of the sanctions. So Iran is now becoming a major trade route. A north-south corridor is developing, and so you have both a growing economic relationship, especially since the two countries are now sanctioned. So no one lives in fear of being sanctioned due to bilateral trade. So the military relationship, the political relationship, and the economic relationship has been enhanced significantly over the past 11 months. I've lost your voice, Scott.
Yeah, no, my dogs were barking in the background, so I was trying to keep them from interfering with the show. But they're silent now. So I'm going to throw out three terms and then ask you to expand on them, what they mean for Russian-Iranian relations. The first term is BRICS. The second term will be the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the third will be the CSTO, the basically the Commonwealth States Treaty Organization. What do these three terms mean to Iran, and how do they impact Iran's relationship with Russia and Iran's relationship with the rest of the world?
Well, Iran isn't a member of BRICS yet, but I think Iran is moving in that direction. Iran is a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but all three of these, I think, reflect a changing world, and the fact that Iran wants to become a part of that changing and evolving world. These organizations exclude the West. That's what's mutual about all three of them. They are comprised of different countries in the global south. Some of them are Asian, and some of them include Africa and the Americas, Latin America to be precise. Iran sees the West as on the decline. Iran doesn't have some, one of the things that you often hear in the Western media is that Iran defines itself through a hatred towards the West, which isn't true. But as long as Iran can't solve its problems with the United States and Europe, then Iran is going to explore new opportunities. And, lo and behold, as Iran is looking for new partners and new opportunities, we see the rise of these powers in Asia and in the global south that make it a lot more easy for Iran to resist Western sanctions and Western pressure and Western military threats. Of course, those threats have died down now, but the sanctions that Western countries have imposed upon Iran. So if Europe and the United States were to change their behavior towards Iran, and if they were to be reasonable, I think they would do that because they need Iran, especially with the rising tensions with Russia and China taking place at the same time. You'd think that Western countries would rethink their policy towards Iran, but I think they're too emotional. The United States has never forgiven Iran for the revolution, and also there's the Israeli factor. Western countries prioritize the Israeli regime over everything else in this region, whereas the Iranians consider the Israeli regime to be an apartheid regime, that carries out ethnic cleansing and so on, and therefore the Iranians see it as illegitimate, like apartheid South Africa. And the solution in the eyes of Iranians has to be like the solution that we saw in South Africa. But in any case, the rise of these new powers create a whole new situation for Iran. For example, when President Raisi went to the recent Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Uzbekistan, and Iran officially basically joined the organization then, that country is actually itself, the whole of Central Asia is a very rich part of the world, and it connects Iran to Eastern Russia, to Central Russia, and to China. So this organization alone provides a huge network for Iran to be a part of. And then through cooperation, through these organizations, we see tariffs being removed. We now see that the Iranians and the Russians have created an alternative to trade, their own SWIFT, because both countries have been excluded from SWIFT. So now that they've created their own SWIFT, and that creates enormous opportunities. And there are a number of other countries that are part of this, that use this mechanism as well. So we see this rapidly changing situation. That doesn't mean the situation in Iran isn't difficult. The sanctions have an impact. But I think as we move forward, and as the West is consuming, the West is being weakened through both the war in Ukraine, the expensive war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, the empire, the decline of empire, the liberal capitalism and its natural, the way in which it is bringing down Western economies, especially after the 2008 and 2009 economic crisis. All these together are beginning to drag down the West in a way in which Iran is gradually less impacted by their sanctions and by their pressure. And whereas at the same time Iran's close increasing cooperation with these non-Western countries and with the rise of these non-Western countries, again, that those new opportunities enhance Iran's position. So I think in what we're seeing is, while things are still tough in Iran, we're going to see a stronger Iran emerge. And I think that if Western countries are smart, they would try to shift their policy towards the country before they become even less influential. But again, just like in Ukraine, just like in China, I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Well, that's a very important point, which brings up my next question. If you take a look at Iran's history, prior to the revolution, it was a very close American ally. And indeed, there was significant cultural and economic interaction. Military officers trained in the United States, academics trained in the United States. There were Americans working in Iran. And when I was in Tehran, even in 2007, I have to say that northern Tehran was very, very much sympathetic to the West. There were pockets of that throughout Iran. So the idea that Iran is this American sentiment is, I believe, misplaced. But I've spoken to other senior Iranian officials about what we call the pivot, or what they call the pivot to the east. That there's always been this pressure within Iran to pivot away from the West because of, as you've said, the inconsistent and indeed outright anti-Iranian. That this pivot may not be permanent, that the West could salvage this situation if it changed its policies. Is it too late for that? Has Iran completed its pivot, or are we still in a transition period where the West could maybe not win Iran back, but at least not lose Iran? Because right now it appears that the West has lost Iran, that Iran is committed to strategic engagement with the, as you call it, the developing South. I mean, where do we stand on this? Is it too far gone? Is it all over? Or is there hope that the West could salvage its relationship with Iran?
The so-called pivot to the east is more than just the east. It's to the global south. So Iran now prioritizes ties with neighboring countries and with Asian countries, but also, as we see in BRICS, which Iran aspires to join, with the global south in general, whether it's Latin America, whether it's Africa. I think this is much more healthy, and I think this is something that most countries should be thinking of. What happened during the Shah's period was Iran's relationship was basically with the West, and neighboring countries really weren't that important. And Europe did the exact opposite. I mean, even those people in northern Iran, as you say, who are very Western oriented, and by the way, they still are, when they look to the West, they don't recognize that the West is actually doing something very different from what we do. When you go after the Second World War, we saw how in Western Europe, these European countries, at least for decades, were able to converge. They were able to expand relations with one another. Now, where the EU is now heading and what's happened, and have they gone too far, or the role of Brussels, I don't want to go into that. But these countries began cooperating in a way in which we hadn't seen before. So what Iran is pursuing now is similar to what the Europeans have been pursuing for a very long time after the Second World War, and that is to engage with neighbors. Iran's relationship with Central Asia was very limited, whereas when you look at the map, you'd think that the relationship would be enormous, and that you'd have huge trade routes and huge amounts of goods, and going through the borders, and you'd have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of students moving back and forth. But that hasn't been the case. It's only something, this is just recent, where the Iranians are now exploring Central Asia, they're exploring China, they're exploring Russia, and other parts of the world, and neighboring countries as well. So this, I think, is a good thing. So this pivot to the east, or this move towards the global south, it basically means that Iran wants to be more global, not oriented in one particular direction, but to look at all opportunities. Now, the reason why it seems so big in the eyes of some is because the West has shut the gates for Iran. They have been hostile towards Iran since the revolution, and that hostility has gradually increased. During the war where Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, they gave him chemical weapons, they gave him all sorts of weapons to use against ordinary Iranians and the Iranian military, and against Iraqis. They, of course, supported the Shah, and then there were the sanctions. All these have created enormous grievances, and the sanctions themselves are basically mean that the gates are closed. So when you have a door, that you have two doors, let's say, that are where one is locked and the other one is open, then obviously any sane person would use the door that's open. If Western countries were to shift policy, hypothetically speaking, I think that Iran would be willing to forgive them for what they've done to the country in the past and move towards rapprochement. I don't see that happening anytime soon, or that happening easily. But I could give you an example how this has happened before. When after Saddam invaded Kuwait, all those countries that were funding Saddam Hussein and supporting him against Iran suddenly tried to mend relations with Iran. One such country was Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia had given more than tens of billions of dollars to Saddam to fight the war. So they were directly involved in the deaths of many tens of thousands of Iranians. But when Saddam invaded Kuwait, the Saudis moved towards Iran. They moved, they wanted rapprochement, and relations were restored. And when Saddam Hussein fell, the Iranians, and this is still some people in Iran, especially the people in northern Tehran, they would say, why don't we get compensation? But the Iranians never, the government, the state, they never demanded compensation for Saddam's war, because they believed that Saddam was a dictator who imposed this on the Iraqi people. And more importantly, if we want to build relations with Iraq, the way to do it is not through compensation, which causes its own problems. The way to do it is to build a sound relationship between the two people, between the two governments, and that is something that, despite the Americans, has happened. Of course, the Americans are constantly trying to wreck the relationship, but that has had a large amount of success. So the Iranians, after the war, improved their relations with Iraq. The Iranians improved, they forgave the Saudis, although now again the relations are very poor, to say the least. And so that is, I would say that these two examples show that it can be done with Europe and the United States, but Europe and the United States will have to rethink their policies. I don't see that happening as we speak, but I think the war in Ukraine is going to bring about huge change in the world. I think we don't really appreciate what's happening around us. I mean, appreciate may not be an appropriate term, because I don't mean it necessarily in a positive sense or in a negative sense. But the old order is collapsing, even though we don't notice it. But big things are happening. And Why do I say this? I lived through 8 years of war. As you pointed out, I fought as a volunteer in the war, the resistance against Saddam Hussein. War is very expensive. Every single bullet costs money. All the destruction, all the weapons used, they wore out Iran and Iraq. The reason why Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait was because he was broke. He was broke, and he went to get, to compensate for the misery that he brought upon the people of Iraq by invading Kuwait, and that, of course, led to the U.S. and the war that you were deeply involved in. You know about more than almost anyone else. But what I mean is that our war with Iraq weakened the economies of both countries significantly. The war in Ukraine is infinitely more costly. From what I've seen, the sheer amount of artillery and weaponry used is just incomparable. I would say that what's happening on a daily basis in Ukraine is equal to some of the most intense battles that we had during the war. And our intense battles would last a few days, or at most a few weeks. Each year we'd have one major battle or two major battles, one major operation or two major operations in a limited area, like 50 kilometers or 100 kilometers. This war is just, it is so intense. I feel sorry for ordinary Ukrainians, because the fire, the artillery, the explosions that they have to endure, I think that for many of them, dying would be a better option than surviving, because the psychological damage that this sort of thing causes is just, I think most people just simply can't comprehend that. So this war is helping is depleting the energy of these declining powers, and that could create major change. It could be, in the long run, make the Europeans and the Americans more realistic and behave more in a more sane manner. But then again, it could make them make very foolish decisions.
Thank you for that. I've got one last question for you, but I'm going to ask it in several parts. So please bear with me. You were the secret man behind the Iranian nuclear negotiating team, according to the media. I don't want to talk about what you were doing, because that's none of my business. I want to talk about the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. Is it dead? Is there a chance that it can be revived? Is Iran concerned that, for instance, the feeling from Washington, D.C. is that the Biden administration thinks it's dead, that it's not going to be revived? Is Iran concerned that any softening of the American approach towards Iran that may have been attached to hopes for the resurrection of the Iranian nuclear deal, that softening is gone, that the West may now seek to be more aggressive in their approach towards what they call Iran's malign influence in the region, whether it be in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, in the Gulf, in Iran itself, Afghanistan. And does this explain Iran's, I think, increased military relationship with Russia and the emerging South? Is Iran seeking to find new alliances that can offset the threat that might be posed by the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, other Gulf Arab states? Or am I misreading this totally? Is there no problem? Everything's going to be fine. We're all going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya.
Well, maybe, hopefully we will. But I think that the only threat to Iran, or at least the way in which the Iranians see it, is the United States. There is no regional actor that is really a threat to the country. But the United States is a very powerful country. But of course, the more that the United States engages in conflict with countries like Russia and China, the more difficult it is for the United States to put pressure on Iran or to make credible threats, because the Iranians know that they just don't have that capability to carry out those threats. I should add something, and it may have no impact on your viewers. I really was just a media advisor to the delegation. I would give my opinion, maybe if they asked me questions about something or an idea, but I didn't play a role, and I was very adamant that I wouldn't. Both in 2015, when Dr. Zarif invited me or asked me to participate at the negotiations in Vienna, I told him I did not want to be a negotiator because that's not my job, and I didn't want to be the spokesman because I thought if I'm the spokesman, I can't say anything. And so I said I will be a media advisor for international media. And Dr. Zarif accepted that. And when Dr. Bagheri, the negotiator, the chief negotiator for the recent talks in Vienna, when he asked me, I told him that, this is what I did last time, and this is what I can do now. He was fine with that as well. So I dealt with the media, and that actually made it quite boring at times, because while these negotiators were killing themselves and arguing at the table and having their own meetings about meetings and about other meetings and day and night, sometimes I really didn't have all that much to do, because after a period of time the media lost interest. It was much longer than what we saw in 2015. In 2015 I was always busy, but this time on sometimes I really didn't have much to do. In fact, I got corona once, so I was stuck in my hotel room for a few days. I wasn't allowed to leave. So, but that aside, I can't say that the nuclear deal is dead. Remember, ever since we came back, first let me point this out, that the deal is on, the text is basically agreed upon. After months of negotiations earlier, the EU, on the last day of negotiations in Vienna, they gave a text. And that text met almost all of Iran's demands, Iran's minimal requirements. Now, what were these negotiations about in the first place? They were about the revival of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. Why did they have to negotiate the revival of the deal? Because the JCPOA had many problems. They had loopholes. The Americans would violate the deal. Obama from day one violated the deal, then Trump tore up the deal, and there were no repercussions for the Americans. So these negotiations were to create a protective layer around the JCPOA so that the Americans could not cheat Iran, so that the Americans would be forced to implement the deal. If they didn't, then the Iranians would be able to retaliate. It would make it costly for the Americans to violate the deal or tear up the deal, and that was good for the deal, because it would create an incentive for the Americans to stay put and for the deal to be implemented in full. Now, during the last day, most of Iran's minimal requirements, it wasn't an ideal text, but it was far better than what we saw in 2015 with regards to the protection of the deal. And it also included and recognized Iran's nuclear tech advancements, because after the US left the deal and tore up the deal, the Iranians suffered economically, but they advanced their nuclear program. So the Americans weren't going to give compensation for all those violations and for leaving the deal. So the Iranians were saying, well, we've made this nuclear progress, and we have to preserve that. So that was also included in these negotiations. Now, Iran's minimal requirements were almost met, as I said. The Iranians took the text home, like the other delegations. They made some changes, sent it back to the EU, and the EU foreign policy chief, Joseph Borrell, said that the Iranian demands were reasonable. At that time, we thought we had a deal. We thought it was over. we didn't think that the Americans would, because Borrell is an American ally, he's not a friend of Iran. But then the Americans, after a long delay, they gave a very unproductive response, to say the least. It angered Tehran. And I think it was quite clear that the Americans were approaching the midterm elections. They got cold feet, and they stopped moving forward. Then after the elections, we had the riots in Iran. And the Americans thought that they could gain new concessions from Iran. So again, they held back, hoping that Iran would give something extra. And the Iranians held firm, and they said, no, what we negotiated is, that's the deal. That's what we'll accept. And after the riots ended, and the Americans saw that they couldn't gain anything from the riots that they supported, and it's clear that they supported it because the MEK terrorist organization that fought for Saddam Hussein, you know them quite well, you know of them quite well. They killed 17,000 Iranians in terror attacks. They fought for Saddam Hussein, and now they're based in Western countries. They're a terrorist organization funded by Western countries. They themselves openly claim that they're involved and they're leading riots. And so do some of these Kurdish separatist groups that are based in northern Iraq, also funded by the West. But after these riots failed, we are where we are. Things went quiet, but the Americans haven't moved forward, or at least they haven't signed the deal, as we all know. But the Iranians have said openly, the Iranian foreign minister among others, that the Americans are sending messages to Iran. The Americans deny it often, but just recently now, I mean, the Americans have actually accused the Iranian foreign minister of lying. But just a couple of days ago, the Qatari foreign minister was in Tehran a few days ago, and he said that he carried a message from Washington. So if the Americans are going to accuse the Qatari foreign minister of lying, they can do so. But I think it proves the point that the Americans are sending messages. Now, will there be a deal? I don't know. I think only people in the White House would know. I don't even think anyone in the State Department can say. Will there be a deal? I don't know. If there is a deal, when will that happen? The ball is in the American court. It's for them to make the decision. The deal has been ready for many months now. There's nothing to negotiate. If the Americans want a deal, it can be done in a couple of days. But as we speak, they haven't made that political decision. Does Iran want a deal? Yes, I think it's clear that the Iranians want a deal where the Americans abide by their commitments and the Iranians abide by their own commitments. And two points that I'd like to point out. Again, going back to those inconsistencies in the Western narrative. During the nuclear negotiations when I was in Vienna, Western media and Western intellectuals and Western elites and Western government officials were constantly saying that Iran is reaching a point of no return. We have to have a deal, saying that, as if like there was going to be some sort of nuclear war, or that the Iranians were going to make a nuclear weapon if there wasn't a deal within the coming days. Well, after the Americans and the Europeans went back to their capitals, it's been many months now, and that imminent threat, no one is talking about it anymore. That threshold, that point of no return, where is that line? It's all disappeared. Why? Because it was all propaganda. They knew quite well that Iran was not pursuing a nuclear weapon. They knew that Iran's peaceful nuclear program was peaceful, but that was their means to put pressure on Iran, to demonize Iran in the international community, through the media, and so on. And another example actually is that I wanted to raise was something that you said earlier. When you came to Iran during Ahmadinejad, his presidency, I'm sure you recall how Western media and Western governments were saying Ahmadinejad is a threat to the world. He's going to destroy the world. Yet at the same time, when Ahmadinejad is a threat to the world, when the next president came to power, they were saying that he doesn't have any influence. He doesn't make the decisions. So when it suits their purpose, they'll say that the president is a threat to the world. When it also suits their purposes, they'll say that the president is a nobody in Iran. These inconsistent narratives and these changing narratives they, I think, they reveal a great deal about how the West treats Iran. And I'm sorry for all my very long answers. I'm a teacher, so I talk a lot. You can imagine how boring it gets for my students. But before ending my response to the question, I would like to just add one more thing. And that is that if there is no deal, in my opinion, the West loses more than Iran. Western Persian media constantly tells Iran that everything is fine in the West. They've dealt with the energy crisis. They don't tell the Iranians that the Europeans are now buying gas at 4 to 7 times the price they were before. So many in Iran think that, oh wow, the Europeans, they're fantastic. They've shut down Russian gas. They've replaced it with other gas. Their economies are thriving. Everything is excellent in the United States, and we're the ones who are suffering, and so on. Especially people in northern Tehran and northern parts of some of the other major cities. But the fact is very different. Even though life is difficult for Iran because of the sanctions, but there are new openings for Iran now in the region, through cooperation with rising powers, through cooperation with Russia. The Russians are very keen on working with Iran. Very keen. They see Iran as a lifeline, both through Iran's potential and also through Iran's experience, through learning how to evade sanctions and live with sanctions, but also because Iran can create a corridor for Russia to trade with other countries. So Iran has new opportunities, and it has learned to live with sanctions, and the West is on the decline. But also because the West has antagonized Western countries need Iran increasingly, and countries like Iran, because they've simply demonized too many energy-producing countries, and they're over-reliant on a small number of energy-producing countries that are not necessarily completely stable. If, for example, the Saudis do not come to terms with the people of Yemen and the war restarts, under these circumstances, what happens to the global energy markets? We know what drones can do nowadays. Is it worth the risk for the Europeans and the Americans to continue down this road? Obviously not, in my opinion. But again, as I said early on, I think that the Europeans and Americans are too emotional, or at least their elites and their leaders. They're too emotional, and that prevents them from looking at things logically. And ironically, one of the things about Orientalism, which you mentioned early on, is that through Orientalism, that narrative, it's often assumed, or it's often said in the West among elites, academics, and others, and traditionally, that Orientals are emotional. But in reality, what we're seeing is that when it comes to Iran, it is Western countries that are behaving very emotionally.
Well, anybody who thinks that you were talking too long, first of all, that's not the case. You have given us a college-level course in Iranian relations with the West, Iran's relationship with Russia. This is invaluable. I would recommend people to save this and refer to it. And I thank you very much for making yourself available and in providing this this absolutely just mind-boggling insight. I'll just add one thing to Professor Morandi's observation. When he talked about how the media has gotten the Iranian government wrong and the reality of the Iranian internal political dynamic, the parallels between that and how the media has gotten the Russian political reality and the internal Russian political dynamic is they're striking, and the dire consequences that are derived from both are there. And this is not an issue that's going to go away. Probably we're going to see Professor Morandi back here again, because we need his insights. And I want to thank him for being here, and I want to thank you for tuning in. Remember, this is the Scott Ritter Show, and knowledge is power.